In this video, we will cover knitting checks. I used them in the sampler in 3 places. 2-stitch checks on the gray and brown scarf, 4-stitch checks on both the pot holder and the blanket. They are knitted in just the same way, only the stitch and row counts vary. First, we'll go over the scarf. We're going to knit 2-stitch checks on this one, and because I just recently knitted tweed, I still have brown running up the side. This is a Fairisle pattern, which means both colors will cross the entire board, as opposed to an intarsia pattern where one of the colors may only cover a few stitches in one position. So for 2-stitch checks, we wrap 2 consecutive pegs in one color, then skip 2, then wrap 2. When I say 2, I mean 2 on each side of the board, as you just saw me do. I lock the yarn into place so it doesn't pull back by knitting over the end stitch before wrapping the second color. In this case, 2 stitches means 2 on the front and 2 on the back board. So it really is a total of 4 stitches getting wrapped, but you'll only see 2 on each face of the fabric. So for the second pass with the second color, we wrap the pairs of pegs that were not wrapped with the first color. Now just knit every bottom loop over every existing stitch to create a new stitch, as you're used to doing. Take note that it is possible to use the classic stockinette wrap and position your colors as you wish. At least in some patterns it is. But it is much, much harder to keep up with which colors go where. And wrapping consecutive pegs, as in this demo, makes a perfectly acceptable fabric in my eyes, blends fine with the classic stockinette wrap. So I recommend that at least while you're learning to do Fairisle, you do this, which is by far the easier method to keep up with. Knitting over is completely normal, but there is one difference, and that is that both yarns will start on one side of the board and end on the other side of the board every single row. Whereas in normal stockinette wrap, they may both start, or one start at the left, move all the way to the right and back in a single row. So we either have to turn the board, if you really only like to wrap with one hand, or wrap from right to left. And here I'm trying to find a way to do my wrapping that does not get in your way. I think you can see fairly well. I'm sorry it is not more perfectly revealing. Because of wrapping directly across the board, as we do for this style of wrap, the stitches will slant just a little bit to and fro, and I just consider that part of the look. But if that's something that bothers you, you will need to learn to do the stockinette wrap, leaving spaces in order to get stitches that are completely vertically positioned. These are 2-stitch, 2-row checks. So we wrap in exactly the same pattern for the first 2 rows, finish them by knitting over, and then change, and all of the stitches that were wrapped, pegs that were wrapped in brown for the first 2 rows will be gray for the next 2 rows, and those that were gray will be brown. The 4-stitch checks, I made 5 rows long rather than 4. There's a reason for this. Stitches are a little bit wider than rows are tall. Their stitch wouldn't fill up a perfect square if you drew one. In double board knitting for 2 rows, it's close enough to square that I prefer to knit 2 stitches wide and 2 rows wide, 2 rows tall. However, when you get to wider checks, 4 stitches, the more perfect square is achieved by knitting that extra row. So my checks, the 4-stitch checks, are 4 stitches wide and 5 rows tall. You can certainly adjust that sort of thing based on the precise gauge that your particular knitting is getting. Just do keep in mind, expect that you will need more rows than stitches unless the checks are very, very small. The stitches on the pot holder illustrate what I'm talking about. the slight left and right tilt of the stitches. They are 4-stitch 5-row checks, as are those in the blanket. So for 5 rows, we wrap the first 4 pegs in gray and the next 4 in red. And for 5 rows, we reverse that and wrap the first 4 in red and the next 4 in gray. Keep in mind that if you turn your board to wrap, you should simply match the row below rather than thinking of the first and second group, because depending on your stitch count, changing ends of the loom when you turn it to wrap may change the visual appearance of what's first. When finished with the contrast color, do the little trick I've shown you in other videos of snipping it, leaving a little tail, knotting a loop into that tail, and hanging it on a peg that holds a stitch of the same color, so it can be knitted off as though it were part of that stitch later, completely locking the tail into position. If you find you enjoy Fairisle knitting, you may enjoy my book called Picture This, available on Ravelry. Lots of Fairisle.